Imagine you wake up one morning and the border of your country has moved overnight. Not because of a war, not because your people voted, because a foreign diplomat drew a line on a map and decided just like that your home now belongs to someone else. That is exactly what happened in 1893, and more than a century later, the consequences of that single line are still shaping wars, governments, and the lives of millions of people. Today, we are going to go deep into one of the most consequential and least understood borders in the modern world. A line that has never been formally accepted, a line that has never been fully enforced, and a line that may be impossible to ever resolve. This is the story of the Durand Line. Before we talk about the border, we need to understand the people it divided, because you cannot understand the Durand Line without understanding the Pashtuns. The Pashtuns are one of the largest tribal societies on Earth, somewhere between 50 and 60 million people, spread across the mountains and plains of what is today Afghanistan and Pakistan. They have their own language, called Pashto, their own ancient code of honor, called Pashtunwali, and a history of fierce, uncompromising independence that stretches back over 1,000 years. Pashtunwali is not just a set of customs, it is a complete way of life. It demands hospitality toward guests, revenge against enemies, protection of the weak, and absolute loyalty to the tribe above all other allegiances, including governments. For centuries, the Pashtun homeland, a region known as Pashtunistan, covered a vast territory across the Hindu Kush Mountains and the plains below. It had no formal borders in the European sense. It had valleys, passes, rivers, and tribal territories that everyone understood without needing a map. The Pashtuns had never been fully conquered, not by the Persians, not by the Mughals, not by anyone. And that proud history of resistance is exactly why what happened in 1893 would create wounds that have never healed. To understand how this border came to exist, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. The 19th century was the age of empires, and no rivalry during that era was more consequential or more dangerous than the competition between the British Empire and the Russian Empire for control of Central Asia. The British called it the Great Game. It was not a game. It was a slow-motion collision between two of the most powerful forces in human history. Britain had built the greatest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, it controlled roughly 1/4 of all the land on Earth, and the crown jewel of that empire, the source of its wealth, its prestige, and its global power, was India. From India, Britain extracted cotton, spices, textiles, and soldiers. India was not just a colony, it was the economic engine of the entire British Empire, and Britain was terrified of losing it. To the north, the Russian Empire was expanding steadily southward, absorbing the kingdoms of Central Asia one by one: Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, Merv. With each conquest, Russia moved closer and closer to British India. British strategists had a nightmare scenario: Russian forces advancing through Afghanistan and reaching the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, cutting off British trade routes and threatening India itself. Afghanistan stood directly in the path of that nightmare. This remote mountainous kingdom had resisted every empire that tried to control it. But now the British decided they had no choice. They had to establish some kind of authority over Afghanistan or risk losing everything. The result was two of the most disastrous military campaigns in British imperial history. The First Anglo-Afghan War began in 1839. British forces marched into Afghanistan, installed a friendly ruler in Kabul, and declared victory. Then came the retreat. In January of 1842, a British army of over 16,000 soldiers and civilians attempted to withdraw from Kabul through the mountain passes in the dead of winter. Afghan tribal fighters attacked them at every step of the entire column. Only one man reached the British garrison at Jalalabad alive. One man. It was one of the most catastrophic military defeats in British history, and it sent a clear message: Afghanistan could not be conquered by force. The Second Anglo-Afghan War came in 1878. Again, the British marched in. Again, they suffered. Again, they found that while they could win battles, they could not hold the country. By the time the dust settled, British commanders had arrived at a different conclusion. They did not need to control Afghanistan directly. They just needed to control where Afghanistan ended and where British India began. They needed a line. In the autumn of 1893, a British civil servant named Sir Mortimer Durand arrived in Kabul. Durand was not a soldier. He was a diplomat and administrator, a man of careful words and precise calculations. The Afghan ruler he was sent to negotiate with was Emir Abdur-Rahman Khan, a man known as the Iron Emir. Abdur-Rahman was no fool. He had spent years consolidating power in a country that had historically been ungovernable. He understood perfectly well what the British wanted. What remains disputed to this day is how much genuine choice he had. The British came to Kabul not just with diplomats. They came with the implicit threat of military and economic pressure behind every word. The emir later wrote in his memoirs that he felt coerced, that the agreement was not freely negotiated, but essentially imposed. The British naturally told a different story. After weeks of discussion, the two men signed the Durand Agreement on November 12, 1893. The document was remarkably short for something so consequential. Just a few paragraphs, a handful of clauses. It established a line of demarcation, a boundary separating the territory under British influence from the territory under Afghan authority. What the agreement did not do was consult a single Pashtun elder, chief, or community about where that line would run. The British drew the border based on geography and strategy. They drew it to protect India. They did not draw it to reflect the lives of the people already living there. The Durand Line cut through the Pashtun homeland like a blade through cloth. Entire tribal territories were split in two. Villages that had been single communities for generations now existed on different sides of an international frontier. A man could stand in his own home and be in Afghanistan, walk 2 hours east to visit his cousin, and technically be in British India. Ancient trade routes that had functioned for centuries were now illegal crossings. Seasonal migration patterns, tribes that moved their herds between highland summer pastures and lowland winter grazing grounds, suddenly required crossing an international border. The Pashtuns predictably ignored the line entirely. They continued moving, trading, visiting, and living exactly as they always had. For the British, this was not necessarily a problem. The Durand Line was never really meant to be enforced. It was a diplomatic instrument, a way of telling Russia, this far and no further. The actual mountains were too vast, too remote, and too hostile for any power to truly police. But the line existed on paper, and eventually, paper lines have consequences. For 54 years, the Durand Line sat in the background of history, officially recognized by the British, officially ignored by the Pashtuns, and largely irrelevant to daily life in the mountains. Then, 1947 arrived and tore the world apart. The British Empire was collapsing under the weight of World War II, nationalist movements, and its own exhaustion. In August of 1947, Britain granted independence to the Indian subcontinent and partitioned it into two nations, India and Pakistan. The partition was one of the most violent events of the 20th century. Millions of people were displaced, hundreds of thousands were killed, entire communities were uprooted overnight. And suddenly the Durand Line, that quiet, largely ignored colonial boundary, became an international crisis. Pakistan inherited the British position. The Durand Line was now Pakistan's official western border with Afghanistan. Kabul refused. The Afghan government's argument was legally straightforward and politically explosive. The Durand Agreement had been signed with the British Crown. The British Crown no longer governed this territory. Therefore, the agreement was void. Afghanistan was not just protesting, it was taking action. When Pakistan applied for membership in the United Nations in 1947, Every single country voted yes, except one, Afghanistan. It was the only country on Earth to oppose Pakistan's admission to the United Nations, a direct result of the Durand Line dispute. The two countries that shared the most history, the most culture, and the most geography had begun their relationship as rivals. As if the Durand Line dispute was not complicated enough, the Cold War arrived to pour fuel on every existing tension. During the 1950s and 1960s, Afghanistan attempted to play the United States and the Soviet Union against each other, hoping to gain enough international support to pressure Pakistan over the border question. It did not work. Washington supported Pakistan, Moscow eventually moved closer to Kabul, and the region became another theater in the global confrontation between superpowers. Then, in December of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. What followed was a decade of brutal warfare that would reshape the entire region and the world. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan funded and armed Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. The Durand Line became a highway for weapons fighters and money flowing from Pakistan into Afghanistan. Pakistan's intelligence service used the tribal territories along the border as a base of operations. The same Pashtun communities that had always crossed the line freely were now doing so with Kalashnikovs and rocket launchers. When the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, they left behind a shattered Afghanistan, millions of refugees, and a region flooded with weapons. And the Durand Line, once just a colonial drawing on a map, had become one of the most militarized and dangerous borders on Earth. The chaos that followed the Soviet withdrawal led directly to the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban emerged in the early 1990s among Afghan refugees in Pakistani religious schools, located significantly in the Pashtun tribal areas on the Pakistani side of the Durand Line. Their leadership was largely Pashtun, their support base was largely Pashtun, and their rise to power was deeply connected to the social and political vacuum created by decades of war and by the unresolved identity crisis of a people split between two countries. When the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in 1996, they did what every Afghan government before them had done. They refused to recognize the Durand Line. After the September 11th attacks, the United States invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, and began what would become the longest war in American history. For 20 years, American and NATO forces fought in Afghanistan, while the Taliban regrouped, in many cases on the Pakistani side of the Durand Line, in the same tribal territories that had never truly been governed by anyone. Pakistan denied it. The United States accused Pakistan of playing both sides. The Afghan government raged against the border it did not recognize, and ordinary Pashtun families on both sides of the line continued to live as they always had, navigating a conflict they did not start and a border they had never accepted. In 2017, Pakistan began one of the most ambitious border construction projects in modern history, a fence along the entire length of the Durand Line. Over 2,600 kilometers of razor wire, concrete barriers, floodlights, and military checkpoints running through some of the most extreme mountain terrain on the planet. Pakistan called it a security measure, a way to stop militants from crossing freely between the two countries. Afghanistan called it a provocation, a unilateral attempt to physically impose a border that Afghanistan has never legally accepted. By 2023, Pakistan had completed large sections of the fence and established hundreds of military posts along the frontier. The result has been a dramatic increase in tension. Afghan and Pakistani forces have exchanged fire along the border multiple times. Pashtun communities that once moved freely across the mountains now face checkpoints, deportations, and family separations. And the fundamental question, whose border is it, remains as unanswered as it was in 1893. The Durand Line is not just a dispute between Afghanistan and Pakistan, it is a window into one of the defining problems of the modern world. When empires collapse, they leave borders behind. Those borders rarely reflect the people who live there. They reflect the strategic calculations of men sitting in offices thousands of miles away, looking at maps instead of looking at human beings in Africa, in the Middle East, in South Asia. The lines drawn by colonial powers in the 19th and 20th centuries are still generating conflict today. The Durand Line is one of the most vivid examples of that truth. A single page signed by two men in 1893 created a wound that 130 years of history has not been able to close. Empires rise and fall, but the lines they draw have a habit of outlasting everything. If you want to understand how the decisions of the past are still driving the crises of today, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Power and Nation, new video every week. And if this video made you think differently about borders, history, or power, share it with someone who needs to see it.